Let me tell you about the best thing anyone's ever done for me at Stanford. Winter quarter of my junior year, I took a class with Professor Gordon Chang on US-Chinese relations. There were a lot of graduate students, and I felt pretty intimidated at first, but I found that I could engage in discussions, and I had something to offer. Some might call this a talent for BS, but I call it being able to engage in a productive conversation when you may not know as much as the other party. Anyways, as the weeks went by, I became pretty confident in myself. You might say I became too confident. My final paper was on Chinese students who came to America in the early 1900s to study abroad. I did what I was used to doing. I wrote it the night before. It had become such a habit that I stopped expecting anything more from myself. I met with Professor Chang to talk about the paper after the grades came in. He sat me down in his office. He said, "Frankly, Niuniu, I'm disappointed in you. I expected more because I know you're capable of more than this." I remember feeling a really strange mix of emotions after this encounter. I was really embarrassed at being called out like that, and I was very disappointed in myself. But I also remember feeling flattered that he had high expectations and that he cared enough to let me know that I'd let him down. This encounter was really influential in my decision to write an honors thesis. I was inspired to really focus on one thing during my Stanford career and see what I'd be capable of with a whole year to write and revise my thesis. I ended up writing about Hu Shi, one of those Chinese students who studied abroad. I will continue writing the thesis next year as I work towards a master's degree from Peking University. I also ended up pulling almost 3 all-nighters in a row before turning in at so, but we don't have to talk about that. We can talk about how writing a thesis gave me the chance to be in a class of all history majors. I see a lot of familiar faces here, and I don't think I would have met a lot of them in any other circumstance. People come to history classes and the history major in general for all sorts of reasons. Every history class I've taken here has brought together an amazing set of experiences and perspectives that have challenged me and forced me to contend, often, with powerful and different arguments. I'm very grateful for that. We're very diverse, but there also aren't that many of us. Sometimes this is why people complain that Stanford isn't a great place to be a humanities major. Sometimes I was one of those people. But looking back, I feel genuinely lucky to have been forced, always, to figure out why and how the past matters while surrounded by a culture so obsessed with the future. I had to repeatedly explain the significance of my thesis to my friends, a motley crew of computer science, communications, bio majors, and more. In the end, I think this was a really healthy challenge, and I'm grateful for it. Though I'll probably be surrounded by people with increasingly similar interests in the years to come, I hope to always hold myself to the standard of what I'm studying should matter and make sense to people with little to no expertise on my topic. Being friends with people who all made a different decision than I did also forced me constantly to think about why I'd chosen this lonely path. My friends all get to talk about their hot TAs, complain about their P-sets, work together in projects, and here I was by myself in the library writing a third paper of the week. In these moments, I would ask myself, why major in history? What am I going to do with it? Unfortunately for my parents, I still don't have an answer to the second question. But I thought a bit about why studying history has always felt so satisfying and so right. And I think it has a little bit to do with how I grew up. As a child of immigrants, I've always had to confront the many stories that made me who I was and the ways they did and didn't include each other. I'm Chinese. I'm American. I majored general track with geographical focuses in US and China, but I always have to qualify this with the fact that I don't specialize in the intersection, but rather on them separately. Because for me, the two narratives have always been separate from each other. School and the friends I made there provided a structure for learning how to be an American, how to vote, who our presidents were, who the Beatles were, what slavery was. There was no such curriculum when I went home. Information came to me scattered and unlabeled. My mom told me about the plays that she put on with her class in school, praising Chairman Mao. Later, textbooks would call it communist propaganda, words loaded with political and cultural implications I didn't really understand. When I was asked to explain my mother, my food, the way I dressed, I often didn't get where the question was coming from, why it was significant, how to translate it. And sometimes I still feel like I don't know enough about where I'm from to explain myself. I still learn new things about my own story every day. In fact, I just found out recently that my parents met playing badminton in Robley Gym, just down the street. That was crazy. My father came from Singapore, my mother from Beijing. Both for complicated, somewhat political reasons. I often feel like I still don't know everything I need to know to really understand their stories. But this urge to understand and explain myself and those around me across language barriers and culture gaps has brought me to where I am today. If being a history major has taught me anything at Stanford, it's that causality is really hard to argue. I have a tendency to believe things because they're true, but not necessarily because, I have a tendency to believe things because they're beautiful, but not necessarily because they're true. I make broad generalizations. I'm doing it right now. Because of this tendency of mine, Professor Thomas Mulaney has likened being a reader for my thesis to playing a game of BS whack-a-mole. So, under the pressure of these very experienced storytellers surrounding me, knowing that I run the risk of them doing some really intense primary source analysis on this speech, I won't sit here and say that being the child of immigrants made me choose a major in history at Stanford. I will, however, use my capacity for suggestion as a curator of my own story and propose that my decision to major in history was likely influenced by my experience as a child of immigrants. Jokes aside, my experience at Stanford as a history major has truly helped me realize how powerful stories are in shaping the way we view ourselves, the people around us, and our place in the world. Some old British guy once wrote that the historian is always forgiving sins by the mere fact that he is finding out why they happened. Herbert Butterfield, The Whig Interpretation of History, published in 1931, page 18. For me, the study of history is an exercise in empathy. It has raised new questions in me about how communities are created, how entire groups of people can be bonded and mobilized, or divided and destroyed with a shared or different narrative. I don't have many answers, but I think I'm sitting on some good questions, and I know I'm surrounded by people who are too. I hope that the earnest search for the answers to these questions can help our communities understand each other across the chasms that separate religions, cultures, and nations. I leave Stanford convinced that we must continue creating and recreating the narrative of ourselves in order to better help those we love, better understand those we fear, and together create a less fearful and more accepting world. I'm very excited for us, and I can't wait to see what the future holds. Thank you.
Thank you, Niuniu, for that, including the citation. I really appreciate the page number in particular. All right, now we actually are going to give out some degrees.